Okay. Hey, Jack.
Dylan, how are you?
Good. How are you doing today?
I'm pretty good today, thanks.
So I wanted to ask you some questions about coming to the village for the first time.
Right.
You started very young, right?
I started when I was about 12 years old,
Mm-hmm.
and on my bicycle.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that if I bicycled down to Perth Amboy, where there used to be a little ferry that ran from Perth Amboy to Tottenville, I could cross Staten Island on the bike, take the St. George ferry, and I would be in New York in about 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And that gave me about 3 hours to ride around the city, and then another 3 hours home. And I did that fairly regularly from 12 to 14. So I got to know the city pretty well, and this is now in the mid-1940s.
And so what was the contrast to Perth Amboy to Lower Manhattan?
Well, Perth Amboy at that time was a small New Jersey city.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't live there. I lived in Seabourn, which was north of that. And Seabourn was formerly a very small, but formerly a resort town from the turn of the century.
Mm-hmm.
And there had been excursion boats and traveling boats that went to Seabourn. So we lived in a rather big Victorian 13-room house that had been during the war a rooming house, and my parents had to sort of renovate it back to a one-family house. So we were north of Perth Amboy. I would bicycle down to Perth Amboy. I didn't really have much connection with Perth Amboy at all. But from Woodbridge, I was able to see across the flatlands and past the ends of Staten Island this arm that stood up, and it had it had this torch in it, and I was convinced that it was going, beckoning me, and so I went.
When did you make landfall as an adult, or how old were you when you finally moved to the city?
I moved to the city right after high school. I think I spent maybe 6 months working after high school outside of Seabourn for an oil company near Perth Amboy, and making my plans to come to New York. I had a scholarship to Cooper Union, and I was trying to work around some kind of plan that I would be able to live in the city and not commute, which was what my parents expected I was going to do. And so eventually I came into the city. Of course, all of this time I'd been coming into the city a lot anyway. After the bicycle, I began to find out I could get there by bus and then by train, and so all that I worked up the, as I had more money, I could
better forms of transportation.
Yeah, better forms of transportation. Excuse me. Eventually, I just went to the city and called my mom. Excuse me, that's a bit of a phlegm problem. I called my mom and said that I had found a job, and so it would be better if I stayed in the city, and then I would come home weekends, and that way I could go to school and be in the city and so on. And of course, I didn't go home as many weekends as I promised, but it got me into New York, which was it was a strong pull. The city was there, and it was vibrating and beating, and things were happening, and I was living in this very small town where everything shut down at 10 o'clock at night.
What street did you live on when you first moved?
Cliff Road.
Oh no, but in the city, what?
I had a room on East 58th Street, way over east, for $7 a week, and I had a job with the British and Irish Railways at Rockefeller Center, which I could walk to, for $35 a week, which gave me a take-home of $27.50. And how I lived on that, I don't know.
And then you started at Cooper Union soon after?
I should have explained it. I was in the night school, not the day school. I couldn't afford the day school. So the night school was 4 years, rather than 3 for the day school. Yeah, so I would work, get some kind of job during the day and go to school at night. And I graduated. I didn't start Cooper Union right away. I was able to, by some miracle, ask them to put me, I got my scholarship in probably 1950, and I didn't really start going until 1953. I used various kinds of excuses. One of the problems was when I first went, in the first year I went, not too long after high school, I realized I was in classes with New York kids who had gone to music and art, spent their lives in museums. Their parents had taken them everywhere since they were little kids, and I didn't have a clue what was going on. And I realized I just had to spend more time around and educate myself a little better. And so actually for 2 years I didn't go back, and then they recognized my scholarship in '53, and I graduated in '57.
What was the social life like? What did you seek out when you finally moved to the city?
Gay life.
Gay life. But
Yeah.
did you manage, you went downtown for the gay life, or was it the bars on the east side?
It was all over town.
Mm-hmm.
It was all over town. The first place I discovered any kind of gay
Congregation or
congregation, no, what's the other word? Congregating. By accident, totally, was the pool at Rockefeller Center. And I suddenly realized there were all these guys there, sort of on their own, and occasionally one would be talking to the other. Finally, somebody came talk to me, and by then I knew, I didn't fully know what gay was, but I knew the guys slept together, and I had been doing it since I was 12. So I began to get an education about gay life from there.
with other 12-year-olds or with men or you know?
No, when I was a kid, with other 12-year-olds.
Yeah.
So that at that time, there were a lot of guys. I mean, they weren't all gay. Straight guys. Guys played around, you know, with one another. Wasn't thought of anything special. But I began to realize that I enjoyed continuing doing it. So there were a lot of guys at Peter Boujar, who became a pretty well-known photographer, was hanging out then there, and I got to know Peter.
At Rockefeller Center?
Yeah. He was younger than I was. He was in his teens. And then I didn't see Peter again for years until actually he became as famous as he became. But that gave me the first introduction. I went to the first gay bar I'd ever been to, and was stunned.
Which one do you remember?
Well, they were all chatting away. I got to know this little group of people, and they were all talking about going to the BP, and I kept saying, "What's the BP?" And they looked at me like I was from another world, and they said, "The Blue Parrot." And they said, "You want to come?" And I said, "Sure." And we walked down 53rd Street to 3rd Avenue, and in the wall was a door, and they opened it, and it was packed wall to wall with guys. And I just couldn't believe it. I've never seen anything like it.
All different walks of life? You know,
No,
variety?
this was mostly East Side kinds of guys. Yeah, East Side kinds of guys. Fairly high level, well-educated, good jobs, not like the Village. I got to know the Village a little later and saw the other side of it. Because in the beginning I was mostly hitting uptown bars. But that was the kind of bar where Tennessee Williams might sweep in with 3 soldiers or 3 sailors or something, and make a big fuss, and hang out for half an hour, and then sweep out again and hit another bar. Because that did happen one night, and everybody just, yeah, right, Tennessee's here, Tennessee's here. So, yeah, that was my first exposure to it.
How did you get down to the Village? I mean, because I mean, you're geographically located uptown.
Well, I was first on 58th Street by myself in a room, and then I met somebody in Central Park who I went home with, but it was nothing special. But he had a garden apartment in the West 70s, in those brownstones that had been broken up into apartments, which are now gone back to being private homes. And rent was pretty cheap, and he wanted to share the apartment. So I shared that with him. And then he had a friend who was moving to the Village, who was looking for a roommate, and I wasn't getting on too well with the guy I was living with, but I liked his friend, so his friend and I moved to Gay Street, to a really nice small apartment there. And then I began to hit the Village. By then I was going to Cooper Union, so that was by 53, yeah.
What was, do you remember the Gay Street rent?
$75.
Split between 2 men.
Yeah.
That's great. So how did you get pulled into the San Remo? You told me somebody invited you from Cooper Union.
Yeah, well, the only bars I knew initially were the bars on 8th Street. It was Mary's, the Old Colony, and Main Street. Mary's had drag shows. serious drag shows. I think T.C. Jones performed there, who was actually ended up on television a few times, Ed Sullivan Show. Mary, the old Colony was basically a restaurant during the day, and late at night it became a big gay bar. And Main Street was just a bar. It was opposite McDougal Street. So it must have been somebody from Cooper Union. It was probably Brant Kingsley or one of my other classmates who already knew that the crowd at San Remo was a pretty interesting mixed crowd, and I probably went with him first time. And once I'd been there, that was it.
You were there straight for
that. I didn't bother going to any other bars.
What was the environment like?
Well, the one thing I really liked about it initially was the San Remo was on a corner. It was pretty big, so it had a long glass walled section that went all the way up McDougal Street past the building entrance and then beyond, because there was a restaurant area in the back, and came around onto Bleecker Street, great big windows. So most bars you went into had a front entrance, and then it was sort of like a bowling alley, and it was closed off. There might be windows, but you really couldn't see in. This was a place you could see in, and everybody outside could, you could see out, they could see in. There was no sense of furtive kind of behavior, whatever. It was just, there it was. Even though there were things going on in there that maybe could be questionable, not as questionable as things got later, but there was a woman named Winnie, a black woman, who used to parade around in there, very proud of herself and very proud of her breasts, and sometimes she would just unbutton her blouse and take them out, show them to everybody, at which point the bartender would leap over the bar and escort Winnie out the door.
But she was always back in.
She'd be back in. Winnie was the famous Winnie, the story around town. It's a true story. She was on the 6th Avenue bus and took off all her clothes. And the bus driver stopped the bus and got everybody out. And then everybody was surrounding the bus looking in. And Winnie was running around like caged inside the bus with no clothes on. And the doors were locked till the police came. So she was a major part of the beat.
Well, you told me that funny story that the beat cop basically made her dress.
Yeah.
And then let her go.
Yeah. He opened the door and he said, "Come on, put your clothes on, let's go." It was interesting the way the various police levels in the village at that time. I mean, there were guys that seemed to understand village-type people, let's say, if you want to include her in that. And then there were the tougher ones that were very perhaps homophobic, or just not knowing how to understand a different kind of life. So I had run-ins with some of them too.
Well, you told me that story, it was after a night at Mary's or something, that you were on the corner?
It was after the night at the Old Colony. We were all, I was standing with a group of friends on 8th Street and 6th Avenue. We were on the west side, and across the street there was another group of straight people standing. And a young officer came along with his nightstick and was rapping on a pole or something. He said, "Okay, guys, break it up, break it up." And everybody got a little bit nervous. There were maybe 3 or 4 of us there. And he said, and I said, "Why?" And he said, "You're not supposed to congregate." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, you know why. You're not supposed to congregate in the streets." And I said, "Well, those people over there are congregating. What's the difference?" And he got sort of stymied for a minute, and he didn't know quite what to say. I think this was something that he'd been told, instructed, but without any background. So that left him nowhere to go. And he just stood there for a minute and said, "All right, guys, just go, okay?" And he walked away. And my friends by then had faded off because they were a little nervous, but I sort of felt that I could really ask him that.
What year was this?
That would have been maybe 1952, say.
1952, so it was it was early.
Yeah, I was still in school then.
Well, tell me a bit more about the environment that there were in San Remo. There were some local celebrities, like Frank O'Hara and...
Well, Frank O'Hara was pretty regularly there, mostly weekends. Chester Coleman would be there, not as often, but he would come in with his crowd, and Frank would have Joe Lasure, maybe J.J. Mitchell. J.J. Mitchell, I think, was a little later, but Joe Lasure was there a lot with him. He was the boyfriend of the day, and then Frank's other friends, and they were at opposite ends of the room. I don't think they had a lot in common with one another. Chester Common was somewhat of what I guess at the time he could edge close to being what was called a bitchy queen.
Yeah.
And Frank was not, and so he had no truck with that.
I guess I heard that Chester Coleman always had the misfortune of picking up undercover cops.
Yeah, he was trouble.
He was supposed to, in his youth, he was a very good-looking guy, right? I mean, that's what I
Chester? He was okay looking. He was not great looking by any means, and whatever good looks he might have had in his youth didn't really hold very long. Frank was good looking.
Yeah, Frank's very appealing
good
with that broken nose of his.
Yeah.
With what and